Right now, I'm logged in with my administrative account. So not my root account, but my administrative account. In IAM, let's start there, and I'm going to create 2 user accounts. So Tom and Sue are going to get created. So under users, I'm adding a new user named Tom. I'm giving them council access. I'm going to use a custom password. And they're not going to have to change their password on the next sign-in. So Tom is set up. I'm not giving him any permissions right now. I'm not tagging him, and then I'm ready to create that user. Okay, so Tom's created, and then I want to create Sue, my other user. I'm giving council access. We're using a custom password again. And the user doesn't have to change their password. No tags, no permissions for that user, but the user's created. So I have 2 user accounts. Okay. And then to go along with our initial setup, in order to grant access to these 2 user accounts, I need to go over to S3 to create my S3 starting point. Okay, so right now I'm logged in with the B. Witkowski account, which is an administrative account. I have access to everything. I can do what I want. I want that for that account. It's an administrative account. But then I want to, after we have the initial setup, so after my development environment and my company environment is set up and is in place, then I want to grant limited access to Sue and Tom. Okay, so I'm going to go over to S3. And I'm going to call my bucket Brian's Company. Okay, I'm going to hit next. We talked on Tuesday about, do I want versioning, any advanced settings that I might want. I can always come back and change it. I'm blocking public access by default. I could always come back and change it if it's going to be a website, but for now I'm going to block public access. And I'm going to create the bucket. Okay, so then I want to go into the bucket to set up the structure within the bucket. Okay, so I want to create 3 folders. So the first folder that I'm creating is a dev folder. I'm going to create another folder called finance. And then I'm going to create another folder called private. And then this isn't entirely necessary, but what I'm going to do is I have 3 folders. I also want to create a file at the root of the directory. So I'm going to skip back over to Adam. I'm going to save this as a text file, and I'll upload this. So I'm saving this on my desktop as start.txt. Okay, so that's the file that's going to get uploaded. And again, I just chose all the default options, and eventually that file shows up here. Okay, so it's not publicly accessible. It's using standard storage. We talked about that for objects. One thing I want to point out with these folders. Folders do not exist in S3. So we have the dialog, create a folder. We created 3 folders. Folders don't exist in S3. They're a logical destination only. There's no physical folder. Okay, so on Windows or on Unix or Linux, we have files, we have folders, we distinguish between the 2. This is just a logical grouping is all I'm doing. Okay, so what ends up happening, if we go back over to Adam, is right now I have this file, and if I have this text file, so let's say I named it dev.txt, the file name is not actually dev.txt. The file name is dev/dev.txt. And this directory doesn't exist. There's no physical directory there. Same thing with finance. If I have a text file in the finance directory, there's a file named finance/finance.txt. Same thing with private. So it creates that logical separation based on my file names. Because they're in that directory, it tags those file names with the directory path included in the file name. So my object name is going to include the directory name. That's how directories work in AWS S3. Okay, there's no physical object there. The physical object is the folders, and they're categorized by this prefix. That matters here in a second. Yeah?
Once you upload resources, do you have to worry about location or anything at all?
No.
Cool.
No. Okay, so our S3 bucket, we have 3 folders. I have 1 text file. I want to put a text file in each of the folders because we're going to want to be able to access them, and we want to make sure that we have the proper access to each of the subdirectories, the dev directory, the private directory, the finance directory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to Atom, and I want to save this file, so I'm just going to change the file name to finance.txt, dev.txt. So I'm going to create 3 new files. Okay, so just 3 simple files. So those files exist. I'm going to upload them in each of their respective directories. So dev should get dev.txt. Again, just using all the defaults, so the file's just created. Then finance is going to get finance.txt. And then private is going to get private.txt. Okay, so now I have 4 items at the root of my directory. I have the folders, and then I have the 1 text file that exists. And then underneath each of the directories that I have there, I have 1 file with a corresponding name that matches the directory name. Okay, they're all text files though. Okay, just keeping them small. Okay, and right now I can go in, I can delete, I can add, I can change, I can do whatever I want because I'm an administrative account. Okay, we know that if I open up an incognito window and try to log in, so I'm going back over to my services, I'm going to IAM so I can get the login URL. So here's my sign-in URL. I can copy it. I'm going to open an incognito window. And I'm going to sign in with either Sue or Tom. Okay, so this is Sue. Okay, so if I go to all services and I try to access S3, Sue does not have access to S3. She has no permission to do anything at this point. Okay. Everyone good with that? When I create a user account, they have no permissions, and that's the way we set up the account. Okay, so then if I go back over to my administrative account, and I'm going to groups now because I'm not going to assign permissions directly to user accounts. But let's say I wanted to provide Sue and Tom access to that bucket. Okay, so I want to create a new role for them. Let's say they're consultants on my project. So I'm going to create a role called consultants. Okay, so I'm going to create a new group. I'm calling it consultants. And in the past, so we saw this once already, I could come through and I could say, I want to provide S3 access. And the only options that I have really are these 2 right here. I can provide either read-only access or I can provide full access and nothing in between. Okay, if I grant full access and I create the group and then I come through for that group and I add Sue and Tom, So I go into the group and I add users. So Sue and Tom go into the group. I should immediately see that Sue now has access to S3. Okay, so if I go back over to Sue's account, so that's the incognito window, and I try to access the buckets, so you'll notice that Sue immediately has access. Sue can go into the company bucket, Sue can open the file, Sue could create a new folder, she could upload files, she can delete files, she has full access, just like an administrator, however, only to S3. Okay, that's great, kind of quick and easy, but I don't think that this is necessarily the way I want it set up. So right now, Sue's capable of creating new buckets. And again, I'm the one paying the bill, so I don't want Sue creating new buckets. Like the buckets there just work where you're supposed to work. Okay, that's how I want to restrict this. I want Sue to be able to do her work, but I don't want her to be able to create resources that I have to pay that she shouldn't be creating. And I don't want her to delete resources that she shouldn't be deleting. Okay, so the policies that we have in place, either administrative access or read-only access, are not going to fit the situation here. So I want Sue to be able to have administrative access to this dev folder, and that's it. And when I say administrative access, I want her to be able to upload things, I want her to be able to delete things, I want her to be able to see the directory. So I want her to have access to that dev folder, but she really shouldn't have access to the private folder or the financials. Okay? That's how we're structuring this today. That's the hypothetical scenario that we're building out. Okay? I think it's fairly common. Okay, so I want to take away that full access role that I had assigned just a second ago. So I really don't want them to have full access, so I'm going to detach this policy. Okay, so now my consultants no longer have access to S3. So I'm back in the same situation where if I look at Sue's account, I get access denied. Okay? I don't want access denied. I want her to be able to get into S3, and I want her to be able to do certain things. So with the built-in policies that Amazon has, I don't have what I need. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to allow the consultants to see the buckets in my S3 service. That's the first start, is if they can't see the buckets, then they can't access any of the buckets, they can't go into the bucket. So I need to be able to allow my consultants to see the S3 buckets. Okay, so I'm going to go to Inline Policies. So there are no inline policies to create one click here. So I'm going to create an inline policy. I'll be upfront about this. Policies are a big topic. Like there's week-long classes at Amazon talking specifically about how to write policies and test policies and stuff like that. If we use the policy generator, this will be fairly straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to use the policy generator. And policies work with the park model is what they call it. And the park model is who's the principal. In our case, the principal would be the user account or group that's accessing a resource. What access am I providing? Am I providing an allow or a deny? And then what resource am I doing that to? So am I doing it to an S3 bucket? Am I doing it to an EC2 instance or anything like that? And then the C, so park, P-A-R-C, stands for what conditions apply to this policy. Okay, and we'll see some of that when we're writing these policies. Okay, so you'll see that park acronym when you're dealing with AWS policies. Okay, so we want to allow access, right? We want our consultants to be able to see our S3 buckets. That's the first policy that we want to write. Okay, so if you look, there's a ton of AWS services. We have to find AWS S3 in here. And it's down here. And then we get into the actions. Okay, so I could choose all the actions, and that's basically saying, oh, I want to make this an administrative policy. But that's not what I want to do. So if I wanted full access, I would have chose full access. I don't want full access. So if you look through here, there's really granular permissions about what users can do. The one that I want is I want the user to be able to list the buckets. So list all my buckets. And if I look through this, you'll see there's a list bucket by tags, put bucket. All of these options, all these actions are part of the AWS API for S3. So what can I do programmatically against S3? These are those actions. Every function is listed here. So the one that I need to start with is I need to be able to list all of my buckets. Okay. And then it's asking for a resource name. Okay, so what the resource name is S3. So the way the Amazon resource name is a unique identifier that Amazon assigns to any object within any service. So any object within any service. The way these resource names work I'm always going to start with ARN colon AWS. So that's always my starting point. We're going to write enough of this that you're going to be fairly comfortable with these resource names here. I'll blow up the font a little bit so you can see. So AWS colon, or ARN colon, AWS colon, S3 colon. That's the service. And then what do I want them to be able to see? I want them to be able to see anything. I want them to be able to list all of the buckets in S3. So the colon, 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 star is within S3. I'm talking about everything. You can see all the buckets. You can see all the files. Okay, I'm going to add that statement. Change the font back. I'm going to go to the next step. And it shows me the policy. So if I'm looking at this policy is a JSON document. So I have a JavaScript object beginning and ending curly braces. And then within that object, I have key value pairs. What version is the policy? So they're verifying it against essentially a validator to make sure it's not misshapen. So make sure that I don't have fields in there that I shouldn't. So it tells me what's the version, and then what's my policy statement. And the policy statement is a collection. So that's what those square brackets indicate. It's a collection of objects. So these statements can get really complicated. I can cascade them. I can have multiple statements applied, but for this, I'm just going to have this one statement, and I'm going to apply the policy. Okay, so you'll notice the policy name sucks. Right? I can edit the policy. So when I was in that review, I should have changed the policy name right here. I never do. I always hit apply, and then I'm like, oh yeah, that name's terrible. I want to be able to have a decent name. So the name that I'm going to use is allow group to see bucket list. And I'm going to apply that policy. Okay, so this policy is applied to our consultants group, and Tom and Sue are part of the consultants group. So now I should be able to see that effect, right? Like I just wrote a policy. My assumption is that I should see the buckets. That's what I'm hoping for. Okay, so now I can switch over to my incognito browser. I'm going back to services. I'm logged in with Sue right now. And you'll see that I am able to see the bucket. Like I only have one bucket here. I can't create a new one. Hello, world, Brian. Okay, it tells me access is denied. You'll see the access that I have on the bucket tells me that there's an error. The only permission that I've granted to Tom and Sue is that they can see the buckets. Right now we just have the one bucket. I granted access for them to see a list of the buckets. That's the permission that we put in place with that policy. So far, so good? Okay, so then what I want to do is I want Tom and Sue to be able to see the contents of this bucket. They should be able to see the root level listing of that company bucket. I don't want them to have access to everything, but they should be able to see the dev folder, the finance folder, the private folder, as well as the one file that's there. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, so I have to go back over to my administrative console to provide access to that root level listing. Okay, so I'm going to create another policy. Again, I'm going to use the policy generator, and again, it's going to be AWS S3. Okay, the actions that I want is I want the users to be able to list the contents of a bucket. They're all kind of organized, but list bucket is the permission that I need. And I want to allow the list bucket permission to that specific bucket, right? So if I head back over to my incognito window, I can see the bucket, Brian's company, but I can't access it. That's the bucket that I want to provide the list bucket permission to. Okay, and the reason I bring that up is because that's going to have an effect on our Amazon resource name. Because now I'm not giving access to S3 anymore, I'm giving access to a specific bucket. And this bucket has a Amazon resource name. So again, we're going to get into like that resource naming convention, which is ARN AWS S3 and now I have to name my bucket. Okay, so we're close here, but with that, the way this is going to work is if I want all of the objects, so I want all the directories and all of the files, I don't have a great way of explaining this, but when I make a request for a bucket, the request always says, what's the prefix and what's the delimiter? Okay, so I want the root level contents of a bucket. So if I'm doing an HTTP GET request for this, which I'm going to do, that's how I show those items in the console. I have to specify what's the prefix, what's the delimiter. Okay, so you'll notice that if I do this same thing, so here's the example. So there's a development, a finance, and a private folder. That what ends up coming back is, if it's a file, it'll show up as contents, because there is no prefix. So the fact that the prefix is empty brings back the files. And it says, oh, that's contents that are in this bucket or this directory. However, if I want the directories, then I need the delimiter there too. And what it shows up is, it shows up as common prefixes. So those directories that I've created, they don't exist, but they show up as common prefixes. And I want to see those. So I want to see the files and the directories. Is that fair? So then if I go back over to my management console, I have to add some conditions in order for that to happen. The conditions end up being fairly tough to deal with, I think. Like, at least this was my initial struggle, was dealing with these conditions. The way the conditions work is I want to say the prefix is equal to an empty string, or the delimiter is equal to a /, essentially. Like, those are the two conditions that I want to add. So I have to, if we're thinking about our programming class, there's lots of ways to compare things. So I could check for equality, I could check for inequality, I could check greater than or equal to, and then I have to worry about types. So what the first thing is what are we dealing with? And we're dealing with strings being equal. Okay, so I'm just doing a comparison of the strings because all of our query string parameters, the delimiter and the prefix, are going to come as strings. The key that I want is the S3 delimiter, and the value is going to be a /. Okay, I'm going to add that condition. I want to add another condition, not for the S3 delimiter, but for the prefix. And the prefix I want to be an empty string. I think I need the double quotes, but I'm not positive. I'll see it in the policy that gets generated. So I'm putting double quotes in there to indicate an empty string. I'm going to add that condition. And then I'm going to add the statement. And if I go to the next step, you'll notice it escapes this stuff, the prefix. I knew it was going to be wrong when I typed it. I really want it to just be a string here. So the policy generator is great. I wanted it to be an empty string. It wasn't letting me create an empty string, so I put an empty string in, but then it doesn't give me the right JSON after the fact. Okay, so I'm going to allow users to list the bucket contents of my bucket that I set up. And I'm going to apply that policy to the group. So now the group has two policies, and I did it again. So you'll notice the policy name sucks. Let's edit the policy name. Allow root level listing of Ryan's company bucket. Okay, now we added another policy, and each policy that we're adding should have some effect on our users, right? The effect on our users for this one is they should be able to click on my bucket now and drill into the bucket and see a listing of the items that are in the bucket. So before, Sue was not able to do that. Now I'm hoping Sue is able to do that. And again, a lot of times I have to leave the service first or just reload the service before that policy change will take effect. So I'm just reloading S3. Now if I click on the bucket, you can see I can access the item. I can actually access the text file, but I can't dig in to any of the folders. So far, so good. Okay, so I might want all of my consultants to be able to get to this point, right? So I'm saying Tom and Sue are developers, and they happen to be consultants. But I might also hire a consultant to do some finance work, right? And I'm going to want those financial consultants to be able to get to the same point. So I have a group for consultants. I'm going to leave the consultants group as is. This is where I want the consultants group to be. They can see things, but they can't do anything yet. What I want to do is I want to create a separate group just for developers. And Tom and Sue are developers, So I want to create a separate group. They're a member of the consultants group, and then I'm also going to make them a member of a developers group. And the developers group is what's actually going to provide access to this dev folder. That's the idea. Okay? So right now, if I click on the dev folder, I do not have access. If I click on any of these folders, I do not have access. After we create the developers group, I want to be able to have access to this dev folder. Okay? That's the idea. So then I come back over, and I want to create a new group. So I have admins, I have consultants. I'm going to create a group called developers. Again, the policies that are available to me are limited. They're to the service themselves, but not to the objects within a given service. I want to control access to the objects within a service, so I don't want these built-in policies. I'm just going to go ahead and create the group. I'm going to add my 2 users to the developer group right away. So my users, I'm adding Sue and Tom. Okay, so if I go back to my groups, Sue and Tom are both in both of those groups. Okay. So in the developers group, I want to add some permissions. So again, I have to deal with these inline policies. I'm going to generate another policy. Okay, first one I want to handle is I want to allow you to list the contents of that dev bucket. Okay, so again, I'm allowing S3. The action that I'm allowing is the list bucket. And then the resource name, so I'll blow up the font again, ARN:AWS:S3. It's always going to take that shape. And then the name of my bucket. Okay, so the name of my bucket is going to be Brian's Company. That allows me to list the contents of my bucket, but I want to restrict it so that we're listing the contents of a specific folder within the bucket. Right? I already was able to list the bucket. We already did that with the consultants. They can list the contents of the bucket. Now I want to allow access to a specific folder within the bucket. Okay, in order to do that, I have to add a condition. The condition is going to be string equals. I did this morning as I was going through this demo. I chose string equals. And then the key that I want is the prefix. So remember how I told you that objects, there is no such thing as a folder in S3? That's important here. What I'm doing is I'm checking the prefix to see if the prefix contains dev. Right, so I'm going to look for the AWS or S3 prefix. And what I'm checking is it equal to dev? I add the condition. I add the statement. Go to the next step. Okay, so caught it this time. Allow list bucket dev. Okay, so here's my policy statement. I'm going to apply the policy. Okay. Now I should be able to go into that folder and see the contents of the folder. There should be one file in that folder, right? Like that was the idea. So if I scroll back over, again, I'm just going to exit out to make sure that that new policy takes effect. I'm going into the bucket. I want to go into the dev folder, and I still get access is denied. And this happened to me this morning. I'm like, I think this is right. And it's not right. So the prefix doesn't equal dev. The prefix is really, it's not going to match the entire statement. So it's not matching that lookup. And I'm trying to do a match. It's almost like an SQL statement. So it's not equal to, I want to know where it's like. So I need a like clause as opposed to an equals clause with the prefix in this case. This would have taken about an hour for me to resolve today if I didn't do this morning. So I'm grateful I did this morning. So I'm editing the policy right here. I can manually do it. I can go back into the policy editor, right? But I know, because I ran into it this morning, that one of the conditions that I could set is that it's string like. Okay, and I'm going to apply the policy. If I create another policy using the policy generator, you would see that. So if I go to the policy, string like is one of them. Okay, I don't need to do this again. So now that that's done, I should be able to go back out. I'm going back into S3, going into my bucket, going into my dev folder. And I'm still getting access denied. Why am I getting access denied? I don't think I should. Let's go back to my policy. Oh. In order to see the contents of dev, I have to say that I'm looking for the contents of dev. So my prefix is dev /, but then the file name is going to be something else. So I'm saying I'll take anything as long as it starts with dev. Okay, that's the like condition. Okay, now I'm crossing my fingers, hoping this works. So now back out again, back into S3. Because if this doesn't work, I don't know what's wrong. But you'll notice that I'm in. Okay, now if I try to upload something, tells me there's an error. The bottom of the screen, it tells me there's an error. I can view the details. It's forbidden. I don't have access to do that. You'll notice the path. So it shows that whole directory structure. Okay, I can't take this file and delete it. Okay, it gives me another error. So now I have two errors. So I can't upload files. I can't delete files. I can't rename this thing. I don't have permission. The only thing I have permission to do right now is to list the directory structure. That was the policy that we attached to our developers group. Right? So if I go back over to my admin console and I'm looking at this policy, the only thing that the users can do is they can list the bucket contents of the dev folder. That's it. So far, okay? I want to grant access to that dev folder so that they can upload files, so that they can delete files. Okay, so I want to allow access to that folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another policy. I'm going to use the policy generator again. I'm going to AWS S3 again. The actions that I want to allow. So I don't want users creating buckets or deleting buckets or anything with buckets, but I do want them to be able to delete objects. Those are my files. I do want them to be able to put a new object in the bucket. And then I also want them to be able to get an object.
What was the first one you selected? Delete.
Yeah.
So get object, that's the one used for accessing it.
Yep, for accessing the file. Okay, so my resource name, we're getting fairly decent at this now, hopefully. So ARN colon AWS colon S3 colon colon colon. And now my resource name, my bucket name, Brian's company. And then I can get specific about what I want you to access. I want you just to be able to access that dev directory. And I'm going to add that statement. If I go to the next step, so these are the actions. I could always add more actions if I want. Like if later they come to me and they say, look, you know, I can delete objects, I can put objects, but I really need the access control list for these objects. Or I really need to be able to get multiple versions of an object, not just the latest version. So get object just gives me the latest version, but I want to be able to get multiple versions. Okay, so if my developers later come back and say, look, in order for me to work on this project, I need this access, I can always come back and change this. Okay, and then the policy name, I want to change that. Allow user to read, write, delete, development. Yeah.
I'm assuming get versions wouldn't matter if you didn't have versioning already.
Correct.
enabled.
Correct. You can have the permission, but it would have no effect on your users.
Right.
Yep. So I apply the policy. So now that group has 2 policies associated with it. And if we've done things correctly, now Sue should be able to create new files, should be able to delete files. So if we want, we can see, can Sue delete this file? Still have an error, but I didn't leave S3, so I don't know that the policies got reloaded. Okay, so I have errors there. I'm gonna actually leave the service and come back in. So I'm going into dev, trying to delete that file. Still tells me there's an error. Access denied. No, access shouldn't be denied. Oh, I did the same thing, sorry. I did the same thing as before. So the allow users to read, write, delete in development, I put the development folder, but it really has to be development /* for any of the files. So if I come back in and edit the resource that I want access to is dev /*. So any of the files. Okay, now I'm going to try to not reload this. We can always reload it, but I'm going to try to delete it now that the permissions have changed. It's gone. If I want to upload it back onto the file system, so here's the dev file. I can put files back there. I can create new folders. Okay, I have access to do what I need now. And again, like I'm not gonna sit up here and say, oh yeah, it's easy to write these policies and to know what's going wrong. What I would suggest though is as you're adding policies, test that the policy that you wrote has the effect that you intend. Right, you saw, I tested it, it didn't work. Like I've been dealing with policies for probably 3 years. So like I'm fairly comfortable with them, but I still screw it up. Like the conditions, I screwed up and it took me about an hour to resolve. Like what the heck's going on? Why am I not getting this pattern match? And I'll be honest with you, I have an advantage over you when I write these policies because I can see additional detailed error information about the policies if I'm using the command line interface as opposed to using the console tools. So it helps me debug what the policy problem is. But it's what we have right now. So as you go forward in the semester, we'll get into the command line tools kind of at the end of the semester, so you'll have some of those tools available to you. But for now, you have what you have. Okay?
At this point, should Sue be able to look into the finance and private folders or just the dev?
Just the dev. So if I'm Sue right now, I go back to my company, I go to finance, I don't have access. If I go to private, I don't have access. Okay. Now, I have things set up the way I want. One thing I could do is I could say all consultants should never have access to my private directory. Okay? Like just blanketly, maybe that's where my company intranet documents are there or something like that, but no consultant should be able to see into that private folder. Okay? So I can come back and I can go to my consultants group. I can create a group policy. I'm going to generate it. The action now, the effect is going to be to deny access. And the way I'm going to deny access, it's again S3. The action that I want to deny is the list bucket. And then the resource name that I want to hit is the ARN AWS S3 for Ian's company. And then I have to add the condition for the specific folder. So string equals. The key is going to be the prefix. It's the S3 prefix. Where am I seeing that? I'm not seeing it. Thank you. I just saw it, and then I'm looking up here and I don't see it. And then the prefix that I want is private/*. I'm going to add the condition. I'm going to add the statement. Deny consultants. Deny private folder access. Okay, so that's my consultants group. Now, Sue and Tom are a member of the consultants group. They're going to be denied private access. What if as developers I granted private access? All right, see how I have those conflicting statements? I haven't done it yet, but if I did, whenever there's conflicting rules in AWS, if there's an explicit deny, that's going to take precedence and we're going to exit. It's not going to continue to check the policies. Even if there's explicit grant or allow access permissions that are in place through policies, so if there's a consultant that has permission to the private folder, because they're a consultant, they're going to be denied access.
That's on conditions. Or that's not the policy.
That's on policies in general. It's how Amazon evaluates policies. If there's an explicit deny in place, it's kind of like a return statement for a function. As soon as I encounter that, then we're going to stop checking. We're going to stop evaluating the policies to see what you have access to. I know you don't have access to that resource. So because that explicit deny is in place, no consultant will ever have access to that private folder. Okay, so if you're following along, what I'd suggest is maybe try that out. Try to grant the developers group access to the private folder like we did for the devs folder. Maybe it's just list objects that you want to grant access to. what's going to end up happening is you do not have access even if you allow that policy. Okay? I'm going to stop here for today, and then I want to introduce the project. Okay, because it's really similar to what we did